So, welcome back, everybody. And as you've noticed, our gathering here is getting slightly more intimate now. This is the really dedicated group now, here for the afternoon session. But it's brilliant to have you all here because we still have quite a lot of ground to cover, a lot of issues to discuss. Now, let's just quickly take stock. What have we done so far? We have spoken about economic and fiscal challenges having an impact on insurance, or digital revolution having an impact on bank sector, on the way lending will happen. We covered the global economy, at least in broad strokes. We talked extensively on various aspects of challenges faced by the European Union, and there will be another panel this afternoon looking at it from the outside perspective, which I'm sure is also going to be interesting. But this afternoon we certainly want to take a bit more time to look at various regions, including China, and as you've just seen in this little video before that one, the United States and the US presidential election, which will be the last panel of the day. And I hope many of you will be here to attend it, because it's going to be quite something, I'm sure. We start, however, with a region that is certainly faced by quite a lot of seismic challenges in particular, and that, of course, is the Middle East. So what's happening there? There's the rise of IS, or ISIS, as it's also called, the fall of Syria, the resurgence of Iran. What do we make of all that? What impact does it have on Europe and the wider world? This is something that our next panel wants to discuss in more depth, and we are absolutely delighted to have Simeon Kerr from the Financial Times here with us to moderate this panel. And his panelists are Aasim Husain, Deputy Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the International Monetary Fund, Jean-David Levitte, Senior Policy Advisor at Rock Creek Global Advisors LLC, and Nader Mousavizadeh, co-founder and co-chief executive officer of Macro Advisory Partners. They come here in all silence, so please do give them a warm welcome.
Okay, thanks very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's 5 years since the Arab revolts and revolutions changed the Middle East as we have known it recently. There's a big, seems to be a yearning for change on one side, but also others trying to restore stability to the region. And within that area, we see a complete collapse in state, clear state determination of Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. And with it, this is all triggering a massive migrant crisis at the same time, which is getting the people in Europe very concerned about it all. So, on the other hand, for the first time, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two countries which have always been very quiet, are suddenly now coming out from their quietest stance and trying to take on a greater regional role. Now, they've helped Sisi, who's using very heavy-handed tactics in Egypt to try and take on the terrorism threat there. But the biggest terrorism threat by far is ISIS still, Syria, Iraq, now into Libya and Yemen. Now, some people wonder what the provenance of this is and how we can deal with it. First of all, in the Saudi side would say ISIS has just been part of the Iranian establishment interfering in the Arab world, and someone has to take it on. But others would say that it's the Saudi exploitation of Salafi thought around the region, which is proving to be very helpful to it as it moves forward. So, finally, there's been a terrible sort of Cold War emerging between Saudi Arabia on one side and Iran on the other. This has affected the whole region deeply, and we're seeing it in every part of the area now. Now, the US has decided to launch a nuclear, to have a nuclear deal with Iran, and that's really helping with the, the nuclear deal is going to, it has really exacerbated the fears amongst the Arab states that Washington is going to get into bed with Tehran. Amidst all these highly complicated, geopolitical problems, the collapse in oil prices over the last 18 months has really changed dramatically the economic basis of the region. We're seeing growth collapse in Saudi Arabia, we're seeing collapse in the Gulf states, we're seeing contractors not paid. But despite this, there's been a real introduction of reform. People always know there's never any change in the Middle East until oil prices go down. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing subsidies tackled. We're seeing a really radical and ambitious reform program starting in Saudi Arabia under the dynamic young 30-year-old Mohammed bin Salman. Now, can he manage to get... There are some deep-seated and really quite challenging entrenched interests in Saudi Arabia who are going against him. We don't know if he can get away with it and whether he can push it through. But he has a lot of support in the country. And that brings us there to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf oil exporters and how they're dealing with this collapse in oil prices. So that's maybe where we'll start. Aasim, could you tell us what you think about how the Gulf oil exporters are dealing with this problem?
Sure. Simeon, thank you for that question. I think that the collapse in oil prices has had a profound economic impact. It's on the Middle Eastern oil exporting countries. It represents a huge economic shock. And I think, if I can, I'll just say sort of the bottom line up front and then maybe talk my way through it. So I think overall, this huge shock represents a very serious policy challenge. But it is a policy challenge that I think is manageable. And I think it's manageable for two reasons. One, the oil exporters in the region are starting off from good starting positions. And second, they have signaled pretty clearly so far, I think, and I'll be specific as to how, their willingness and ability to react to this large shock. So I think for both those reasons, it looks manageable, but it will still be a serious challenge. Now, before going further, let me just say that there's a distinction, of course, across all oil exporters. And there are some oil exporting countries, such as Libya, Yemen, and to a large extent Iraq, where it's not just the oil price drop, it's obviously the conflicts that they're engaged in that are having an overwhelming impact on their economy. So what I'm going to say doesn't really hold for them. What I want to talk about is more the Gulf countries, and I think it also holds true for Algeria, the policy challenges they're faced with. Iran is also a little bit of a separate case because there the driver is sanctions relief and sort of the positives that may bring for the economy. But sort of what is the story then for the Gulf countries? The shock is large, and I think the biggest impact is on the fiscal positions of oil exporting countries. So they went from fiscal surpluses of something on the order, on average, of 10% of GDP during the period of high oil prices, when oil prices were 100 plus, to deficits of about 10% of GDP today. Clearly, this 10% of GDP deficit is not sustainable forever. But, and so they're going to need to adjust. Adjustment has started, but they're also coming from very good starting positions. They've accumulated large savings buffers over the years of high oil prices, which they've already started to use, and they have room to use further to buy them time to make the fiscal adjustment that they're now engaged in. They also have, almost all of them, very little debt to begin with. So they have the capacity to issue debt going forward, again, over the period in which they're adjusting. But the adjustment will have to happen, and it's going to be a contractionary force on their economies, and it will slow down growth. But I think the question, and it gives rise to what I see as two key challenges for all the Gulf oil exporters. And the first one is related to financing. So during the period that they will adjust, whether it's the next 3 years, the next 5 years, or even the next 10 years, they're going to be running up debt. They're going to be running down their buffers. How will this financing be done? What impact will it have on the availability of credit to the private sectors in their economies? What impact might it have to liquidity in their banking systems? So there's a set of challenges there that they will have to deal with. Then there's another challenge, and that is with respect to growth. As public spending is restrained going forward, what will happen to growth in those economies? And I think much more important than the growth question is the jobs question. So what will happen to job creation? And in most countries, the young labor force or the entrance to the economies is quite large. In the past, many of them have been employed in the public sector. Clearly, the capacity to continue that is now going to be much more constrained. So the private sector will need to grow faster in order to absorb all the new entrants to the labor force.
And that's the heart of the issue. The Vision 2030 for Saudi Arabia, it's a very big, radical change. They want to increase the private sector, they want to reduce the public sector, and create jobs for the Saudi youth, who have so far been rather reluctant to take on the more productive element of the economy. I was maybe John David. Do you see it as is it realistic for Vision? Do you think it's realistic that they will be able to transform this cultural shift to get the youth into more productive work?
It will take time. Of course, it will take time, but it's a good moment to start this necessary process. Because of the oil shock, the population understands that there is a need for change, no other way for a future. A key factor, it seems to me, is the feeling among the Saudi population that Saudi Arabia is back on the regional stage with the two crown princes and a very dynamic foreign policy. There is pride, because at last Saudi Arabia is challenging the Iranian foreign policy and so on and so forth. So in this climate, I would say, of national unity behind the new leadership, it was a good opportunity to present a vision. Second, the very fact that a vision has been proposed to the people is a positive development, because now people understand where the country should go and how. Of course, we don't know yet the details, but the fact that the young second crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, has presented this 2030 vision is in itself a positive development. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia is at the same time, as you said, a country with a young bulge, which is a huge problem, but also asset. And second, a very conservative society at the same time. So, in a nutshell, my expectation is that, yes, the program of reforms will be implemented, but it will go slow. In this conservative society, don't expect a revolution, expect a slow transformation of the workforce, of the economic situation, lesser investment in the state structures, growing role for the private sector, and so on and so forth.
So, Nader, a slow, steady evolution rather than evolution. But can Saudi Arabia afford to take it so slowly, given the massive decline we've seen in their wealth, and the fact that they clearly have fears about the sustainability of oil revenues for their economy? And we've had domestic issues there. We've had domestic terrorism being a problem the last decade or so. I mean, what are your thoughts about the pace and how fast they should push it?
No, I think, as Jean-David says, there is finally someone has set out a 21st century relevant vision for the future of the country, which is an enormously important and I think positive step forward. I think the thing to keep in mind here that this is an aspirational document and not a technocratic document. Very few people actually expect the targets to be met at anything like the pace that they're being set out. But the very fact that these aspirations now have been set out in the way they have, that they have the backing of the most dynamic leader in the kingdom, and that it is coming from someone who clearly understands the world he lives in 2016, economically educationally, demographically, regionally, is hugely important. Having said that, clearly there are huge structural challenges. And Saudi Arabia will now go through the beginnings of what will be a hugely important but very difficult transition. So when people say, do they have enough time? Is the pace quick enough? My basic view is, look, Saudi Arabia is on thin ice, but finally there's someone who's going to run and isn't going to walk across the thin ice. Now, whether he can run fast enough, whether the burdens on his back are too heavy, I think is an open question. Because when you look at the demographic question, when you look at the lack of skills development, when you look at the educational system, when you look at the resistance, certainly in important parts of society still, to these kinds of reforms and changes, there is a very considerable challenge to overcome. But I think the sense that you get in the region, and I was there last week, among leaders, both in business and politics, is that there is now a sense of Saudi Arabia on the move, in a direction, broadly speaking, which is good for them and good for the outside world. I don't think anyone has illusions about the difficulty of meeting these objectives, but someone is now setting out to lead it, and that's a very important development.
Do you think he'll be given a full run? I mean, there's obviously been a lot of speculation that perhaps, the Crown Prince before Mukrim was ousted to let him go forward. There could be changes in the ruling family. Members of parts of the ruling family are resistant to change. They like things where they are very much. There's obviously the technocratic class who've had things cushy for decades now. Are they going to be willing to push these reforms through? I mean, what about, any of you want to deal with those issues, like how they can deal with all of that?
I think just a quick point on this. I think it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. One is that it remains a very conservative society and a very conservative elite. So even though there's a 30-year-old who is very much in the driving seat of this reform agenda, it remains a society which expects a certain age of its king. And I think that will play out in this dynamic. There is a crown prince, and there's a king, by the way, who is engaged in ways that people, I don't think, entirely appreciate. And the second thing is that this is a system and a government and a regime that obviously is sustained by hundreds of princes who, as part of the family, run important parts of the country and the economy. And so my expectation is that this actually will run a fairly smooth and actually fairly predictable course, even though one hears rumors of one kind or another.
If we go across the Gulf to Iran, seismic changes there recently, the end of the start of the rollback of sanctions. What do you see as the prospects and the challenges for the Iranian economy at the moment, Aasim?
Well, Simeon, the Iran nuclear deal is certainly a big deal for Iran itself, but I think potentially also a pretty big deal even for the global economy. So the Iranian economy is among the 28 largest in the world. Its reintegration into the global economy represents potentially a big impact on global trade and therefore global growth. It's some calculations that colleagues of mine did 6 months ago, just ahead of the deal, looking at sort of trade elasticities and so on of economies of the size of Iran and so forth. Their reckoning was that the reintegration of Iran into the global trade could boost global GDP by 0.25%. In say, the next 4 or 5 years. So the potential is quite large. But at the same time, the challenges are also quite significant. So Iran has gone through recently a period of sanctions, but even before that, of not a great deal of integration with the global economy. And so Iran's economic structure is not really equipped to deal with full market forces overnight. In particular, its financial system is creaky. There are high non-performing loans in the banking system. The banking system also has to deal with what they call frozen assets, so assets of government and state-related enterprises that are not performing, but they're not quite non-performing loans either, that are not yielding income. As a result, banking sector's intermediation costs are very, very high, and that's reflected in high interest rates. So the private sector cannot easily obtain credit at reasonable terms with which to grow. Competition within the economies in terms of business climate, or just pure competition in terms of numbers of firms in particular sectors, or the ability of firms to enter sectors is limited. The climate for doing business for foreigners is is also not yet clear. So all these obstacles are there. The deal will boost Iranian growth this year almost certainly because of increased oil exports. And that will give the Iranian economy a kick for the next maybe year and a half. Some of that increased oil income will filter into the rest of the economy and lead to increased non-oil activity. But to go beyond that, in terms of sustaining growth, in the 4 or 5, even higher range than that into the future years, will require serious reforms to the financial system, to the business climate, even to upgrade the macroeconomic policy framework, because they're not sort of suited for a modern economy just yet. Inflation has been brought down from the 40% range when sanctions were imposed to under 10%. But it's by no means a settled thing. They need to be able to sustain low inflation.
And isn't that the point, Jean-David? It's actually been slightly disappointing at the beginning. The sanctions have been come down, but the US sanctions remain. Banks are probably, some of our guests here might know better than us about how reluctant they are to lend to trade or investment into Iran now because of the exposure to the US banking system.
And this is a key problem. This is a key problem because what is at stake, as it was said, is the possibility to have Iran back on the economic world stage as a key actor and a promising country. We have to make sure that the companies which want to invest in Iran are able to do so. And this is not the situation at this moment because of the sanctions. They have been lifted in Europe, elsewhere. They have been lifted in part, but in part only in the US. You represent the banking community, and you know what I mean. If you are responsible of a big bank, and if you have to work in the US or in dollars, and you want to invest in Iran, you think twice, because you want to be sure that you will not be the target of the judiciary system of the US. So a few days ago, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, encouraged the banking system of Europe, the big banks, to be more aggressive, more dynamic in their engagement in Iran. But the answer is, hey, wait, we want to be sure that we will not be punished as banks were punished for reasons which had nothing to do with the nuclear program, but with the other sanctions which remain because of so-called terrorist activities of Iran and human rights problems and so on. So as long as this problem is not solved, then it will be a handicap for the implementation of the nuclear plan in its economic dimension. I fear that nothing will be solved before the US presidential election, and then we will see where we are. But what is at stake for Iran itself is huge because we will have a presidential election next year in Iran. Rouhani will be candidate for re-election. If he is not in a good position to demonstrate that the deal he was fighting for with success is delivering the promises of better growth for the economy, better situation for the families, then we may have a political problem, and the ultra-conservative parties will bash on President Rouhani, and it may trigger a bitter surprise for everybody. So I think this is a key moment, and we have to work hard with our American partners to solve this key issue.
Now, do you see political risk to the deal? Is it potentially under threat going forward?
I think as Jean-David very rightly laid out, the potential for Iran is huge, and the risk is very significant. It's important to remember that Iran in itself, not dissimilar to Saudi Arabia, is actually coming into a potential, also very important moment of transition after 35 years of self-isolation and imposed isolation from the outside as a function of the nuclear deal. But what's going to get in the way, again, in understanding Saudi Arabia as much as Iran, it's the politics, not so much the economics. And in the case of Iran, it's clear that those who were opposed to the deal, both in Washington and in Tehran, do not think the fight is over. In Washington, the fight is continuing by making any benefit to Iran extremely limited, if at all. And in Iran, the effort very much is to ensure that Rouhani and the reformist wing of the regime, which is very much still the regime, is to prevent them from being the beneficiaries of the benefits of the deal, and so that he doesn't actually get another term at the next elections. And it's important to remember that both sides here, the opponents in Washington, the opponents in Tehran, absolutely know what they're doing. Because the longer this will take by way of the nuclear deal to show benefits in Iran, the more those who oppose it from the beginning and those who certainly want the reformists not to benefit will have a stronger and stronger voice, so much so that you can actually put in jeopardy whether the continued implementation of the deal actually will take place. In which case, of course, the opponents in Washington can say, see, we told you so. So this is entirely understood by both sides about what they're about. But having said that, again, it's important to remember that if you take a slightly longer view and we can manage this transition, the opportunity not just for Iran, 80 million people, highly educated, more women than men leaving universities, resource-rich, human capital-rich, is not just an opportunity for Iran, but for the Gulf region. They will be principal beneficiaries from Iran actually emerging out of this isolation economically, if they can just sort out the politics. And I say that not as lightly as it sounds at the end there.
What sort of potential sort of development could we see domestically within Iran over the next few years, do you think, in terms of the economy? Which areas are going to maybe attract the most foreign investment, do you think? Aasim, sorry.
I think the key for Iran is to develop its non-oil economy. But let me start by saying, first of all, Iran is a much more diversified economy than those of the Gulf. Oil represents a much smaller share, not only of output, but also of, say, fiscal revenues or of the budget. I think there is clearly potential for Iran over the longer term to increase oil output, and new oil contracts are being devised to facilitate that. But that is going to be something that takes several years to develop, provided that investment happens. Meanwhile, the Iranian economy, because it has been relatively closed for many years now, there is great scope to grow. And interestingly, I think Nader made the point about the human capital in Iran. So if you compare human capital indicators in Iran to say, even Europe, Iran does very well. Iran's capital to output ratio, and it's, again, I emphasize ratio, not overall capital, but Iran's capital to output ratio compares quite well to Europe. Where Iran has been lacking is productivity. So productivity is well below 2/3 of the level of Europe. And that's representative of the relatively closed economy with not that much competition and investment climate not being that friendly. And that's where I think growth will happen or can happen, and it can be in a wide spectrum of both industrial and service sectors. And Iran produces a very large number of engineers, and I think perhaps produces the largest number of female engineering graduates every year in the world. So the potential to grow in say, ICT is potentially phenomenal.
Jean-David, you bullish on Iran domestically?
Bullish is a bit an optimistic word, but I'm confident that if we can solve the problem of the financing of the foreign investments in Iran, inside, as you said, and outside, as I explained, then there will be hope for reforms, provided that the political situation allows the implementation of these reforms. They are necessary to boost productivity, as you said. There is the problem of what should be the role of the ultra-conservative Revolutionary Guard economic power, and that's a key question to be addressed, the sooner the better. But all in all, I totally agree with the fact that Iran's society is well prepared to take full advantage of the opening up that it is already decided through the nuclear deal, that it is hoped for by massively the young population of Iran, and the fact that there is also a very important community of Iranians living in Europe, in the United States, and so on, is also a positive factor. So all in all, I'm optimistic about the future, provided that the nuclear deal is properly implemented.
Nader, I mean, John David mentioned it there, the Revolutionary Guard's sort of stranglehold on the economy. Does that need to be dismantled in order for the development of the Iranian economy to come into the global sphere? Does that need to be dismantled, or can it be somehow sort of accepted?
Well, I think what you want to think back at is what are the pillars of legitimacy for the regime, right? Well, how does it sustain its power? It has been revolution for a long time. It has been anti-Americanism for a long time. And this is, remember, still a regime that is predatory both abroad and at home, if you look at human rights and if you look at its behavior abroad. The Revolutionary Guards are obviously a very important pillar of the regime, not the only one. One of the ways in which this regime has sustained its hold, unlike others, is that there is more than one center of power. There may be infighting between them from time to time, and there may be rivals, but they all have everything to lose from the end of the regime and everything to gain from sustaining it. And so when people think about Iran long term, I think the parallel that may be as close or as useful as any other is to think about how China has developed over the last 35 years. The PLA plays an enormously important role in the Chinese economy. You can't really do business in China without being somehow involved with the PLA. And now the PLA isn't externally involved in the way that the RGC is. But I think the trajectory that is most likely is something like, in the best case, is a slow opening economically to the outside world, less of a hostile relationship with its neighborhood, but where elements such as the RGC, because of their control of large and important institutions, directly or indirectly, will continue to play an important part. And that, again, given current US sanctions legislation, puts a very significant limit on what you can take by way of risk as a foreign investor in Iran. Because even if you're not in any kind of contravention of the nuclear sanctions, the ability to demonstrate conclusively that no partner of yours and no business dealing of yours in Iran has any benefit to the IRGC is a very, very high bar. In an environment where, as Jean-David said earlier, you're exposed to regulators in the United States who think nothing of levying $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 billion fines on banks. So that is a dynamic that has to be considered.
And speaking of the IRGC, Syria, there's obviously a huge problem at the moment. We're talking about individually Saudi and Iran, the domestic economies, but the overall sort of ambiance of the region still is fraught with sort of geopolitical risk. Maybe Jean-David, I mean, can you talk us through about where you see these, at the moment, the Iraqi government's trying to kick ISIS out of Fallujah, there's a potential move on Mosul, but the situation in Syria just seems intractable.
Well, you have three wars. The first one I will say a word of is Yemen. Here, I'm quite optimistic about the possibility to reach a political agreement before the end of this year. I think it's possible. I think that the leadership in Saudi Arabia now wants it. And so on this one, I'm quite optimistic. Then you have a situation in Iraq. In Iraq, it seems to me that there is a kind of informal alliance between the US and Iran. We know that to fight with success against ISIS, you need first to make sure that the Shia militia will not be involved in the fight, because they would antagonize the Sunni, even if they are now under ISIS control. And that's the role of Iran, to make sure that the Shia militia stay out of the game. But then you need a well-functioning, well-equipped Iraqi army. And that's where the US have to play a role to retrain and re-equip the Iraqi army. So you have a kind of informal alliance between Iran and the US to win this battle of Fallujah, then Mosul, and to eradicate ISIS from the Sunni Anbar province in Iraq. Then you have the worst scenario, the worst situation, which is Syria. And here, I don't see hope in the near future of a political or military solution. If I had to propose a solution, I would say, well, there was a great success, which was the nuclear deal with Iran. The tool to achieve this success was the P5+1 format. That is, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany working together, negotiating for years with Iran and concluding a deal. I hope that this same P5+1 format will call the 3 regional powers to the table of negotiations, that is, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and exert pressure on these 3 regional powers to make sure that they will play a positive role to solve this intractable problem of the war in Syria. The problem we have is that ISIS is not the first preoccupation of the 3 regional powers. If you look at Turkey, the first preoccupation of President Erdogan is the Kurds. If you look at Iran, the main preoccupation is to make sure that the Shia axis will survive, from Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And if you look at Saudi Arabia, their number 1 preoccupation is precisely the dominant role of Iran in the Shia axis. What are they doing in Arab land? So, unfortunately, on Syria, I'm less optimistic. But if there is a will, there is a way, and the P5+1, in my view, is the best tool to provide the political solution, which is absolutely necessary.
Nader, what do you think? Do you think there needs to be a sort of Saudi-Iranian rapprochement before any of this can get off the ground? Or, I mean, what's the main driver, do you think?
Well, look, I think long term, what needs to happen for the region to get out of its geopolitical crisis is a different conversation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. There's no question about that. And maybe some of these changes will be the impetus to that. I think the other element, though, I would just touch on is that when Jean-Levitte lays out this menu of objectives for Iraq and elsewhere, which are very difficult to achieve. I mean, to get a predominantly Shia country to say that Shia militias should not be part of taking these cities when there is no effective army to do it instead, is one thing. And then to get a P5+1 coalition on Syria, I think, again, is entirely right. The big gaping hole, though, is US will to play that role of a convener. The United States, and I don't think this is a cyclical matter, I don't think this is about President Obama alone, the United States is structurally taking a different view about the relative benefits of investing the kind of capital, time, and treasure and blood that it has in the Middle East. And so there will not be that forceful US convening authority. I don't think on Syria, I don't really think on Iraq. There's clearly an incentive for the president now to try to get some wins before he leaves office. They may take back Raqqa, but as we see now, all the focus now is just on taking it, very little planning actually for the day after. So, ultimately there has to be a regional solution to this, because at the end of the day, it is Iran and Saudi Arabia who will be there and be there forever and be invested forever in ways the United States and the West are not going to be. And so I think the best thing actually could be to do much more to encourage the beginnings of a dialogue, without any illusions about how difficult it will be, between Riyadh and Tehran.
I'll take a couple of questions which come through, I think, on Twitter, and maybe for Aasim, this is quite relative to you, I think. Given the fiscal pressures Gulf states are facing, if the sovereign wealth funds repatriated overseas investments, would this have a material impact on markets and liquidity, given the size of these funds?
So, Simeon, I think this relates to one of the challenges that I mentioned that Gulf countries are facing, and that's the financing challenge. So they have large budget deficits, by and large, all of them, and those budget deficits have to be reduced, brought back into balance over the next whatever, 4 or 5 or more years, depending on how large their existing buffers are. So during that period, the deficits will need to be financed, and how best to do it. Clearly running down your sovereign wealth fund balances is part of that strategy. One reason why you accumulate those buffers in the first place is to be able to precisely use them at a time when you need them. But similarly, some of those investments may be locked up in assets that are not so liquid, or that liquidating those assets may entail a loss in the value of the investment. So it may be desirable instead to borrow in the meantime. And in the end, I think a combination of these strategies will need to be used. So some rundown of sovereign wealth fund assets, which may in turn put some downward pressure on asset prices globally, because sovereign wealth funds are invested globally. Some increase in domestic debt, and some increase in external debt. Now, the more domestic debt is issued, the more pressure there will be on domestic banking systems, because either they will be buyers of that debt, or depositors of in banks will instead be buying that debt. And so the liquidity situation of banks will be tightening during that period. So it will be a bit of a balancing act, making sure that just enough is issued domestically. But I should mention that this is also a time to develop capital markets in the Gulf, and it could be an opportunity. So issuance of domestic debt in the countries themselves could give rise to the development of a more buoyant or deeper debt market, which in turn will allow greater reliance of the private sector on non-banking credit or
Indeed, and it is the year of debt in the Gulf, right? I mean, this is the year when people are going to market. This relates to another question that came through. Rating agencies have downgraded some GCC countries with a negative outlook. I think that relates to the most recent Moody's downgrades. How will this impact bond pricing that the GCC states are intending to issue in international markets? Everyone's most excited about the Saudi bond, which should be coming later on in the year. Jean-David, what do you reckon? I mean, how are they going to... how will the Gulf change from one that's being reliant on sovereign wealth for so long to suddenly having to persuade international markets to lend to them? I mean, what kind of changes are they going to have to go through?
Well, first, Vision 2030 has been presented, but we don't know yet the details. This is for next month. And so let's wait for the details. Second, speaking of Saudi Arabia, frankly, I'm not anxious about their financial situation, and you explained brilliantly why. And so I don't see any difficulty for either Saudi Arabia or the other Gulf state to get the money they need to finance their reforms.
Nader, what do you think about debt and the Gulf, and how they might be shifting into that zone?
Well, I think it's. I mean, they clearly, as Aasim said earlier, this has been a massive shock to their fiscal position. What's happened in the oil prices of the last couple of years, and I do think that there is, they're on track for some very significant deficits this year, next year, and they do need to be financed. I mean, what size treasury holdings Saudi Arabia really has, some of this is coming more public. And so I think, there is a sense, and certainly in the Gulf there's a sense that actually this is a very sobering moment, that they do need to take on these reforms, not just because they will need to attract foreign direct investment, but because they need to develop and diversify their economies. And I think, in the optimistic scenario, this is actually an investment opportunity in an economy that has not diversified, that has essentially stood still as a rentier economy for a very long time. And then as some, clearly not all, but as some of these plans get executed to some proportion of success, these will lead to investment opportunities to investors, certainly in the Gulf, who know Saudi very well, but others as well. So again, I think it needs to be seen as the beginning of a painful but necessary transition that also will involve these other forms of financing.
And, sorry, go on.
Simeon, if I can come back to that, this is with respect to the Saudi Vision 2030. So it is, I think, as both Nader and Jean-David said earlier, it is clearly a recognition by the leadership in Saudi Arabia of the challenges that they are confronting and what they need to do. The recognition that they cannot depend on oil. They need to diversify away from oil, and it's the private sector that has to lead the way out of oil. So I think those are very important steps that were previously not there. Putting them sort of on the table is key. In addition, it's not just the Vision 2030 that's been put out. They've done quite a bit already in restraining spending, already from the end of last year and into this year, and it's very much part of the process. They've done something that also previously had never been done before, not just the Saudis, but actually all the countries in the Gulf, which is increase energy prices. So energy was dramatically underpriced, and energy prices have been raised anywhere from 30 to 100% depending on product in virtually every Gulf country. And in the case of Saudi Arabia and in a few others, they're still well below international levels, but big steps have been taken. So now, reassuringly, so far, the acceptance of these changes, the big spending cuts, the increase in energy prices among the population has been, quite reasonable. So I think the population recognizes the challenge that the country is facing. But
take you on, the water pricing issue has been a disaster. Mohammed bin Salman essentially had to sack the water minister because so many people were complaining about the massive increase in their tariffs. So that was one reaction. Things didn't go according to plan. And if you look forward, I mean, this is a country that's been reliant on these subsidies for so long, and people got so used to cheap petrol, got used to cheap electricity. We haven't even reached the summer yet when the ACs go really high, and that's when we'll really see how they're going to react to that. It's a rentier economy. This was part of their bargain. Their bargain was that we have a nice, cheap life, and you get to run the country. Do you think this can carry on without political reform? Do people need to be given more of a say in their country if they're going to accept such deep reforms that are encouraged by the IMF?
Well, so that's what I was just getting to. So in order for the vision to actually be carried out and to be implemented, and the actual measures have yet to come. But in order for the vision to actually materialize, it has to be done in a socially sustainable way, in a way that is acceptable. And in order for that to happen, it has to be done in a way that's perceived to be fair. So how will this play out? I think the fairness aspect will clearly be very important. I think so far the steps that have been taken have been largely okay, but yes, large increases in energy prices going forward will require some type of compensation mechanism, at least for the vulnerable groups. Another aspect of the social or the economic model in Gulf countries has been employment of the population in the public sector. That's probably not going to be, in fact, that's almost certainly not going to be sustainable going forward. The number of people being employed by the public sector will have to be much less. Now, calculations that we've done, there's about 300,000 Saudis entering the workforce every year. So that's about 1.5 million over the next 5 years. In order for the unemployment rate to stay at its current level, either the elasticity of growth to employment has to change a lot. So, and so far, growth has not been very employment intensive, at least not national employment intensive. There's been construction, but that has employed a lot of expatriate labor. And then there's been a lot of import intensive construction as well. Forward-looking, the growth has to be much more national employment intensive than before. So either that needs to happen, or the share of nationals in the private sector, currently about 20-25%, has to go up quite significantly to a third or more in, say, the next 5 or 6 years, in order for the unemployment rate not to change. So probably all three things will happen. The elasticity will increase, the share of nationals in the private labor force, in the private sector will increase, but also I expect unemployment will increase. So this is where the social strains will be important. And
We're very close to the end. Jean-David, are you positive on Saudi?
I totally agree with this analysis. I think it's less about political reform than diversification of the economy at a pace which will allow the massive young population, not enough educated, to get the jobs they need. That is the key question. It's less about political reform, it's more about the pace of diversification of the economy, and here the key actor is the private sector. It exists in Saudi Arabia, but they have to understand that now the future of the country is more and more in their hands, less and less in the state structures, and this is where the big question mark is.
And Nader, maybe to conclude, I mean, there's always so much negative news in the Middle East. This time of reform in Saudi Arabia, is that something to take comfort from?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've talked about and what we heard today is a sense that there is, very significant opportunity in Saudi Arabia, very significant opportunity in Iran, that there are huge geopolitical challenges to get through, but that in the fundamentals of both these economies, there's real promise. One thing to keep in mind about Saudi Arabia is that as they set out on this course, they are attempting something for their society of a scale, of an attempt to create legitimacy, and an attempt to transform their economy of a kind that has never been attempted, much less achieved in that country before. So the task is enormous, and certainly they will need as much help as they can get from the outside world.
Okay, there you go. You've got to help Saudi Arabia, but it's nice to end on a positive note there, so thank you very much for your time.